Welcome to a Legendarium special about the Great North American Heat Wave of 1896. In the year 1896, which is fitting, 3 years into a crippling economic depression, Eastern North America sweated through a grueling heat wave. It wreaked havoc across the region's major cities, including New York, Boston, Newark, and Chicago. Over 10 days in August 1896, temperatures averaged 90 degrees Fahrenheit coupled with 90% humidity and little wind. At night, temperatures never dropped below 72 degrees, with 3 consecutive nights at 80 degrees or above. At first, the scorching weather only endangered people who had to work outside all day. These included mostly Irish laborers who worked as teamsters, longshoremen, and railroad workers. On Monday, August 10th, the death toll began to alarm New Englanders. That day, 5 people died in Providence, Rhode Island. On Tuesday, August 11th, the Boston Globe reported a startling list of fatalities from the excessive heat. 10 people died in Boston that day, 20 on Wednesday, and 15 on Thursday. In Holyoke, Massachusetts, some boys playing around a barn noticed a corpse inside. It belonged to Patrick Curran, a log driver who probably went into the barn to sleep. Officials believed that the heat killed him and caused his body to rot after only 24 hours. As the heat worsened, farmers left fields, public works projects stopped, and factories closed. Horses dropped dead in the street, 120 in a single day in Boston alone, adding to the stench of horse manure spread on the streets. People found unconscious victims in coal sheds, in the woods, and on the pavement. A watch factory in Waltham, Massachusetts, reported 19 cases of heat prostration on August 10th alone. Temperatures of 97 degrees registered in Providence, Rhode Island, 100 degrees in Springfield, Massachusetts, and 104 degrees in Webster, Massachusetts. It got so hot in Haverhill that a thermometer burst. People succumbing to heat stroke behaved very strangely, and the stories became widely reported across New England. Kate Carley, for example, lost the power of speech for several minutes before she collapsed. And Annie Deckman, a cook at Lander's restaurant in Boston, dropped an order, wandered back to her tenement, and then died a couple of hours later. As the Boston Globe reported, no warm wave which has visited this country in recent years has held out longer, has been more continuous in its intensity, or more fatal in its results. Not only has it piled up the death rate to alarming proportions, but it has kept all humanity sweltering in perspiration and maddening heat. Yet the catastrophe would be far greater in nearby New York. Eastern North American heat wave caused over 1,500 deaths in the city, killing more people than the far more famous New York City draft riots of 1863 or the Great Chicago Fire combined. Inside the brick and stone tenements of the city, temperatures could hit 120 degrees, literally roasting the city's working poor alive. Despite the staggering death toll, the heat is far less known because of the people it most affected, namely the working poor. The press and political leaders simply took far less interest in them. The Lower East Side of Manhattan became ground zero for the deadliest effects of the heat wave. The city's Parks Department recently banned sleeping outside, so many New Yorkers sought refuge from the sweltering heat in increasingly creative and dangerous locations. They took to the rooftops and fire escapes, trying to catch a breath of fresh air. Inevitably, somebody would fall asleep or get drunk, roll off the top of a 5-story tenement roof, and be killed. Children fell asleep on fire escapes and then fell off and broke their legs or worse. People tried to go down to the piers on the East River and sleep there, only to roll into the river in their sleep and drown. On the last day of the heat wave, Mayor William Strong finally called an emergency meeting of the city's department heads. The Public Works Commissioner opened fire hydrants across the city to cool down the population and moved city worker shifts into the cooler parts of the day. After the end of the heat wave, the city lifted the ban on sleeping outdoors. At the time, Theodore Roosevelt served as police commissioner and proposed distributing ice throughout the city for free. Ice had been priced out of reach for impoverished New Yorkers because of an ice trust founded by Maine businessman Charles W. Morse. He bought up the largest of New York's ice companies and became known as the Ice King of New York. When smaller ice companies in Brooklyn, Yonkers, Long Island, and Montauk began to sell in Manhattan, Morse bought them up too. He finally formed the Consolidated Ice Company in Maine in 1895, and during the heat wave, Morse took advantage, more than doubling the price of ice, leaving the poor with no access to the potentially life-saving good. Perhaps Charles W. Morse should have been known as the man with a heart of ice. However, Theodore Roosevelt would not stand for this and personally passed out ice, thus bypassing and breaking up the ice trust. Roosevelt wrote to his sister of what he saw, saying, "The horses died by the hundreds so that it was impossible to move their carcasses, and they added a genuine flavor of pestilence, and we had to distribute hundreds of tons of ice from the station houses to the people of the poorest precincts." This experience shaped Roosevelt's future as he would go on to fight for tenement reform. Finally, the heat wave helped to end William Jennings Bryan's bid for the presidency. During the height of the heat wave, Bryan arrived in New York to officially accept the Democratic Party's nomination for the presidency at a massive rally held in Madison Square Garden. Party leaders set up an emergency hospital in the basement as a precaution against heat stroke and exhaustion. The temperature inside the building reached over 100 degrees, and Bryan, either concerned or exhausted or both, simply dryly read his speech off the manuscript, giving it none of his usual enthusiasm or energy. Thousands of New Yorkers left early, and most considered the speech a failure. Bryan's campaign manager then canceled a tour of New England, and in November he lost New York and the election to William McKinley. And in a historic irony, when President McKinley was assassinated 5 years later in Buffalo, New York, it would be Theodore Roosevelt, the hero of the heat wave, who assumed the presidency. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.